Grace Episcopal Church. Thank you for coming out and joining us tonight. My name is Drew Gibson.
And I'm Don Hewell-Horn. More than 150 years ago, Charles Dickens wrote a ghost story. Since it takes place around the time of Christmas, it is somewhat like an Advent calendar. You know, those little paper calendars, often in the shape of a window or a tree, and the windows in them that open each day as you get closer and closer to Christmas Day.
Like an Advent calendar, this story is a series of windows into the London of Dickens' time, allowing us to peep in on a variety of Christmas scenes. But all these pictures are for a purpose: to raise a ghost. The ghost of an idea. May it haunt your lives pleasantly.
To begin with, Marley was dead. Oh, there's no doubt whatever about that. His burial was registered by the clergyman, by the clerk, and by the undertaker. And Scrooge also signed the book, and his name was as good as any bill of exchange. Yes, old Marley was dead. Dead as a doornail.
Not that there is anything particularly dead about a doornail, at least not from my own knowledge. For my own sensibility, I would have said that a coffin nail is the deadest piece of ironmongery that there is. But you get our meaning. Marley was dead, and Scrooge knew it.
Scrooge had been his business partner for I don't know how many years. He was his sole executor, sole administrator, sole friend, sole mourner, and even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event of his passing.
Now, Scrooge never repeated out Marley's name from where it stood above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. People new to the business sometimes called Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. Scrooge answered to both names. It was all the same to him, even though Marley was certainly and undeniably dead.
Now, Scrooge, oh, but he was a tight-fisted one, squeezing, grasping, wrenching, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner.
As hard and as sharp as flint, but without even a warming spark. Secret was he, self-contained and solitary as an oyster.
The cold within him froze his features, nipped his pointed nose, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red and his thin lips blue. He always carried his own low temperature about with him, and no warmth could warm him, nor could any wintry weather chill him.
Now, once upon a time, upon a Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, foggy weather, and although only striking 3, already quite dark. The door to Scrooge's office was open so that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who sat in a dismal little cell just across from his own. Now, Scrooge had a very small fire in his office, but the fire in the clerk's was so very much smaller that it looked to be just one coal. Now, he dared not replenish it, for Scrooge kept a coal box in his office, and the clerk knew that if he were to go to it with his shovel, he might return without his job. And so he tried to warm himself at his candle, but being a man of no strong imagination, he failed in this attempt.
Suddenly a voice piped out of the cheeriest room. "Oh, Merry Christmas to you, Uncle! God save you!" Well, it was Scrooge's nephew coming in unannounced. His face was ruddy from his walk through the frosty afternoon, and his eyes sparkled with good health. "Ah, there you are! A Merry Christmas!"
A humbug!
"Christmas, a humbug? Uncle, you don't mean that, I am sure."
I do. Can't you see that I'm busy? Merry Christmas indeed. What right do you have to be so merry about anyway? You're a poor enough flock.
"Come then," replied his nephew gaily. "What right do you have to be dismal? You're rich enough."
Bah! What's Christmas but a time for finding yourself 1 year older and not an hour richer? Why, it's a time for you, sir, to be paying bills you cannot afford. Why, if I had my way, every idiot who goes about with a merry Christmas upon his lips should be boiled with his own pudding.
"Uncle!"
See here, you keep Christmas your way and let me keep it mine.
"Keep it? But that's just it. You don't keep it."
Well, let me leave it alone then. Much good may it do me. Much good has ever done you or anyone.
"Uncle, there are many things from which I have derived goodness, but from which I have not specifically profited. Christmas is, I dare say, among them, but Christmas time is such a good time, not only for its sacred, precious origin, but as a kind time, a pleasant time, a forgiving and charitable time. It is the only time I know of when men and women seem by one common consent to open their hearts freely and to think of people around them as they really are, fellow travelers on the same journey which ends for all of us at the same place. Therefore, though it has never put a scrap of silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and continue to do me good, and I say God bless it.
To which sentiment the clerk, in his solitary office beyond, quietly seconded, "Hear, hear." But Scrooge put an end to that activation with a slap to his desk.
Now, Uncle, don't be angry with me. I say, come dine with me this evening.
I'll see you buried first.
Uncle!
Good afternoon.
I want nothing from you. I ask nothing. Why cannot we be friends?
Good afternoon.
I am sorry with all my heart you find that you are so resolute. But I will keep my Christmas humor to the last. So Merry Christmas!
Bah!
And a Happy New Year!
A humbug!
While the clerk let the nephew out with all the greetings of the season, he also let in two large, portly gentlemen who stood hats off in Scrooge's office. They had notebooks in their hands and they bowed to him. Scrooge and Maury, I believe, said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Maury?
There's no pleasure for me to be addressed by either of you, gentlemen. Marley's dead. He's been dead these 7 years. Died 7 years ago this very night.
Our sincere condolences, but we have no doubt that his generosity is well represented by his surviving partner.
Well, he was right about that, for Scrooge and Marley were of one mind when it came to generosity.
At this festive time of the year, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at this present time. Many thousands are in want of common comforts and even necessities.
Are there no prisons?
Plenty of prisons.
And the workhouses, are they still in operation?
Well, they are, though I wish I could say they are not.
That is a relief. I was afraid something might have stopped their useful work.
Yes, as you say, but since they scarcely furnished some of those unoffending multitudes any Christian cheer of mind and body, we are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some food and drink and means of warmth. We chose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt in abundance and rejoices. What shall I put you down for?
Nothing.
Ooh, you wish to remain anonymous?
I wish to be left alone. Since you asked me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I do not make merry myself at Christmas, and I cannot afford to make idle people merry. My taxes, my quite considerable taxes, go to support the prisons and the workhouses. Those who are badly off must go there.
Many can't go there, and many would rather to die.
Well, if they would rather die, they had best do it quickly and decrease the surplus population.
Well, surely, at this time of the year...
It is not my business. It is enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere in other people's. Mine occupies me greatly. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
At length the hour of shutting up arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted his stool, then thus signaling to his clerk that the day was over. Instantly the clerk had his hat on and snuffed out the candle.
You'll be wanting all day tomorrow, I suppose.
If it's quite convenient, sir.
It's not convenient and it's not fair. Why, if I weren't going to pay you, you'd think that pretty rough treatment, wouldn't you?
Yes, sir, but it's only once a year, sir.
Yeah, a fine excuse for robbing a man's pocket every 25th of December. Well, still, I suppose you must have the whole day. But just see that you're here all the earlier the next morning.
And with that, the office was closed in a twinkling. The clerk, with his long white scarf dangling below his waist, for he boasted boasted no winter coat, ran home as hard as he ever could to join his family.
Well, Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having scrutinized the papers and his banker's book, went home. He lived in chambers that had belonged to his deceased partner, a gloomy pile of rooms at the end of a narrow yard. Nobody lived there but Scrooge, all the other rooms having been let out as offices. Well, the yard was dark. The fog and frost hung thick about it all as Scrooge walked up the path to the door. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing particular unusual about the knocker on the door of his house, except that it was somewhat large. Scrooge had, of course, seen it night and morning during his residence there. It is also a fact that Scrooge had as little of what might be called fancy as any man in a financial district. But that evening, having his key in the lock of the door, Scrooge saw not the knocker, but Marley's face.
Marley's face, with a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, and it looked at Scrooge the way Marley used to look at him, its ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred as if by a current of hot air, and although the eyes were open, they were perfectly, horribly motionless.
As Scrooge stared fixedly at this phenomenon, it became a knocker again. Pooh, said Scrooge, and shut the door with a bang. But he did look at the back of the door, half expecting to see Marley's pigtail sticking through it. There was nothing there, however, and the door closing resounded through the empty house like thunder. Every room above and the cellars below, each giving out their own echoes. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes, but still, he fastened that door extra carefully. Now he walked up the stairs to his apartment in the dark. Scrooge did not mind the dark, for darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked that. But before he shut the door to his own rooms, he walked back and forth through his whole apartment once, just to make sure. The face upon the door was enough to make him want to do that.
Everything was as it should be. Nobody under the table or sofa, a small fire in the grate, and his dressing gown hanging undisturbed in his closet, as it should. He locked himself in and took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown, slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire.
He sat in his chair, and leaning his head back, he noticed something odd. A disused bell hanging high on the wall, connected for some now forgotten purpose to elsewhere in the building, slowly began to move of its own accord. With a sense of foreboding, Scrooge watched as that bell began to ring out loudly, and then he heard every other sound and every other bell in that building also start ringing out themselves. While he was still trying to make sense of this, he heard another sound. It was a sound coming deep, deep down below inside the house, as if someone were dragging heavy change across the barrels in the cellar.
The noise became louder and clearer on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming down the hallway, coming straight towards his door. It came on, coming right through the heavy door, and a ghost passed into the room.
Scrooge stared at it with a mixture of astonishment and dread, and then he recognized the spectacles, the pigtail, the waistcoat, tights, and boots. It was Marley, or at least the ghostly remains of him. Scrooge also observed that his partner had a chain clasped around his middle, a long, thick chain which stretched out behind him, which appeared to be made out of ledgers, deeds, padlocks, and cash boxes, all wrought from a ghostly steel. Scrooge stared at it. He didn't believe it, but he saw it. He looked at the phantom, and he looked through it. He saw the kerchief which held its chin up to its head, and he felt its death-cold eyes upon him. But still, he doubted it. What was he seeing? How now? What do you want with me?
Much, said a voice, and there was no doubt that the voice was Marley's.
Oh, who are you?
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
Yes, I am getting on, aren't I? First the door, now this. Oh, dear me.
You don't believe me. You doubt your own senses. Why do you doubt what you yourself see and hear?
Because one's senses can so easily lie. Why, a slight disorder of the stomach might, for instance, produce a mild hallucination. You may be nothing more than a bit of undigested beef, a blot of sour mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. Well, there's probably more of gravy than the grave about you, sir.
Oh, yelled the ghost, hoping out what change it could and shaking them with a deafening roar while it howled out in piteous and dreadful wail. It was a shriek of rage, dismay, and the most heartbreaking sadness. Is this an undigested bit of beef?
Shaken, terrified out of his wits, Scrooge fell to his knees. Oh, Spirit, please have mercy on me, have mercy. I do believe you, I do. But why do you come? Why do you walk the earth in this fashion?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk among his fellow men. And if he does not go forth in life, he is condemned to do so after death. I cannot rest. I cannot linger in our counting houses. Because in life I was in my spirit and never walked beyond the narrow limits of our counting houses. I was once foolish enough not to realize the vast usefulness we had to give to our fellow creatures. Any Christian loving soul working kindly knows that, and I did not, and you do not. Neither do you realize that no amount of regret can make up for the wasting life's precious opportunities to do good. Now weary journeys stretch out before me forever.
But you always were a good man of business, Jacob.
Business? Cried the ghost. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, those were my business. My trade was but a drop of water in what should have been the ocean of my real business.
At this, the ghost picked up a length of the heavy chain, as if that were the cause of his grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground.
It is at this time of the year that I suffer most. Why did I, as a man, never notice that blessed star? The star which led the wise men to the stable, and which still shines as a beacon in the hearts of men? Were there no homes to which its light could have led me? Hear me.
Please, Jacob, don't be hard on me.
I am here to warn you. And you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance which I have procured for you, Ebenezer.
You always were a good friend to me, thank you.
You will be haunted by 3 spirits.
Well, Jacob, not to be ungrateful, but 3 spirits?
Hear me. I do he what wailed, shaking his chains at Scrooge. Without their visit, you cannot hope to shun your path I walk, except the first, when the bell tolls 1. And
as Scrooge watched, the spirit that had been Jacob Marley vanished in the direction of the window. Pooh, pooh, was his nervous response. But drained from the interview, he retired to his bed without undressing and fell asleep.
When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out between his bed curtains, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the wall of his chamber. Suddenly, the church bell tolled a deep, hollow, melancholy 1. Lights flashed in the room, and in an instant, the curtains of his bed were drawn aside by a strange figure, one who was like a child and an old man at the same time. His long hair was white with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle on it. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, while in contrast, its dress was trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head, there sprung a clear, bright jet of light, by which all of this was visible.
Are you the spirit whose coming was foretold?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
Your past. Rise and walk with me. And the spirit's grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. As I touch my hand here, you will not fall, said the Spirit, and he laid his hand upon Scrooge's heart.
As he did so, the two of them passed through the wall and stood in the busy thoroughfares of the city. By the frost in the air and the dressing of the shops, it was clear that here too it was Christmas time. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse which Scrooge immediately recognized as the place of his own apprenticeship.
They passed through the walls and beheld a rather large gentleman in an old-fashioned high-powdered wig sitting behind a very large desk. Scrooge cried out in great excitement,
"Why, it's old Fezziwig! Ah, Fezziwig, alive again! Ah!"
Mr. Fezziwig was just laying down his pen to look up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, and laughed all over himself from his shoes to his nose as he called out in a comfortable, booming voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick!"
And a living and moving picture of Scrooge's former self as a young man walked briskly into the room, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. "Ha! Dick Wilkins, to be sure. Ah, bless me. There he is. Good old Dick."
"Yo-ho, my boy," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Clear away, lads, clear away, and let's have lots of room here."
Well, it was done in a trice. Everything movable was packed off. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse became as warm, bright, and snug a ballroom as you could wish. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk, making an orchestra of it. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. And in came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. And in came their 6 followers, whose hearts they broke.
In came the young men and women employed in the business, as well as the baker, the cook, the housemaid, and the milkman. And they came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some pushing, some pulling, and soon 20 couples were dancing at once, down the middle and up again, round and round in various groupings. Old Fezziwig clapped his hands and cried out, "Well done!" to the fiddler, who bowed, plunged his face into a mug of beer, and continued.
There were dances, games, and still more dances. There was cake, punch, cold roast, boiled ham, and mince pies. The high point of the evening was when the fiddler struck up that sprightly old air, "Sir Roger de Coverley," and Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig stood out to dance as the head couple. Now, they had their work cut out for them, for everyone there could dance and were not to be trifled with. But Mrs. Fezziwig, why, she was a wonderful partner in every sense of the term.
And Mr. Fezziwig? Why, a light seemed to positively shine from his silk-stocking calves. The couple stood up and stood. It shone in every part of the dance. Bow and curtsy, turn your partner, thread the needle. Why, old Fezziwig cut so deftly that his legs veritably twinkled.
Now, when the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually, wished them all a Merry Christmas.
"A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. He has spent but 3 or 4 pounds of your mortal money at the most. Is that so much that he deserves such praise?"
To this, Scrooge objected, pointing out that it wasn't the money, but that Fezziwig had the power to render them happy or unhappy, and to make their service light or burdensome, and that the happiness that he gave them was quite as great as if it cost a fortune. And so saying, Scrooge became thoughtful and still, for he would have very much liked to have said a few words to his own clerk just then.
Then the scene before them faded and melted away. In the scene that emerged, Scrooge saw himself once more, only this time he was older, at the prime of his life.
He sat in a parlor, with music in the rooms behind him. He was sitting on a settee by the side of a fair young girl in a black dress, and in whose eyes were tears.
"It matters little to you, very little, that I see that another has displaced me in your heart. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one, Ebenezer. until this master passion, gain of money, has engrossed you. That is your true love, is it not?
What are you saying? It is just that I've grown so much wiser, that's all, said this younger version of Scrooge. Have I changed toward you? Have I ever attempted to seek release from our engagement?
In words, no, never. But in a changed nature and an altered spirit, yes. If you were free today, can I believe that you would again choose a poor girl such as I, who has no dowry? I know you regret it and repent of it, and so I release you, and do so with a full heart for the love of him who once you were.
Spirit, must you? Let's leave this place, please, at once.
These are shadows of things that have been. They are what they are. Do not blame me.
Please, really, I cannot bear it. Remove me.
And as Scrooge struggled with the spirit, he was suddenly conscious of an irresistible drowsiness. He had barely time to notice that his bed was once again before him, and he collapsed upon it and sank into a heavy sleep.
Awakening in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, Scrooge sat up in bed to get his thoughts together. After his last encounter, he was quite prepared for anything, but he was not prepared by any means for nothing. He huddled under the bed curtains, under the bedclothes, the heavy curtains drawn tight together, and listened. He waited for some new specter to approach, but there was nothing there, only silence. And then again, the church bell struck 1. He heard the crackling of a fire, and peering out through the bed curtains, saw a light peeping from underneath the door to his sitting room. He rose, cracked the door open, and looked in to see a fantastic transformation. Why, the walls and ceiling were so hung with living green ivy, mistletoe, and holly that it looked a perfect grove. There was a mighty blaze roaring up the chimney, more exuberant than any in Scrooge's time, and its light reflected off the holly leaves like so many hundreds of tiny mirrors.
Heaped upon the floor, forming a kind of throne, were cooked turkeys, geese, and game, great joints of beef, suckling pigs, and wreaths of sausages. There were minced pies, plum puddings, chestnuts, and cherry-cheeked apples, oranges, pears, immense cakes, and great bowls of punch. Such a glory! And in an easy state, upon this couch, there sat a giant. Wonderful to see, who, as soon as he noticed Scrooge peeping in around the door, bellowed out to him, "Come in, man! Oh, come in and know me better. I am the ghost of Christmas present."
Scrooge entered meekly and beheld the great figure who nearly touched the high ceiling and who was clad in one simple, deep green robe trimmed with white fur. The garment hung loosely upon his great frame so that his broad chest was bare, as were his feet. A wreath of holly was on his brow, and in his upraised hand he held what looked like a horn, like a drinking horn or a horn of plenty, but from which glowed a fire that sprinkled out golden, joyous particles of light.
"Oh, do you know me? Or any of my family?" said the giant. "There have been over 1,800 of us, you know."
I do not.
"Come, touch my robe."
Scrooge did so. He and the giant passed invisible through the walls and out into the streets of the city on a Christmas morning. That it was Christmas Day was clear from the bustle of the people in the streets and their good humor. Men shoveled snow from the rooftops and doorsteps. Children laughed. Steam billowed out cheerfully from the few shops still open. On these pleasant scenes, the giant sprinkled the blessings of his torch, making them pleasanter still.
Invisible, Scrooge and the ghost passed through neighborhoods filled with Christmas scenes until they arrived on the street where Scrooge's clerk lived with his family. Coming to the house of Bob Cratchit, for that was his clerk's name, the giant blessed the house with the sprinklings of his torch. Imagine that, blessing the house of a miserable Bob Cratchit who made but 15 shillings a week.
They passed through the wall of the house to observe the complete picture of one family's Christmas. They saw a busy Mrs. Cratchit dressed in an old gown made fresh with new ribbons, for ribbons are cheap and make a good show for sixpence. She and Belinda, the second Cratchit daughter, were laying the tablecloth, while Master Peter plunged a fork into a saucepan of potatoes. At age 14, he felt quite the grown-up and was nearly choking on the high-starched collar which he had borrowed from his father for the occasion.
The two smaller Cratchits, a boy and a girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside of the neighborhood bake shop they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. Basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the room, whooping in anticipation of the dinner soon to come.
"Whatever has got your precious father and your brother, Tiny Tim?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And Martha, why, she weren't even the slave last year."
"Oh, here's Martha now, hurrah!" said one of the smaller Cratchits, as Martha appeared at the door. "Wait till you smell the goose," they said, as they danced around her, chattering excitedly, seeming to be everywhere at once. She apologized for being late, but as an apprentice to a shop that made bonds and fancy stuff, she had to work late that night before and that morning.
"Well, so long as you are come, dear, that's the thing."
Finally, Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's clerk, came in with 3 feet of scarf hanging down before him. His threadbare clothes were darned and brushed to look as good as they might. His son, Tiny Tim, rode upon his shoulder, but alas, he carried a little crutch in his hand, and his body was supported by an iron brace.
Martha ran into her father's arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim off to hear the pudding singing as it boiled away in the copper kettle. "How was church, dear?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "How did little Tim behave?"
"Oh, as good as gold and better," said Bob. "He is thoughtful, you know, sitting by himself so much, and he thinks the strangest things you've ever heard. Oh, he told me coming home that he hoped the people in the church saw him because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to reflect upon the Christmas day and upon him who made the beggars walk and the blind men see."
The short silence that followed was then quickly broken by an active little crutch tapping upon the floor as Tim and the others came back. Tiny Tim took up his stool near the fire, while Master Peter and the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits went forward to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession.
Mrs. Cratchit had the gravy hissing hot.
Peter mashed the potatoes with great vigor.
Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce,
while Martha dusted off the hot plates.
Bob placed Tiny Tim beside him in the corner of the table, and the 2 young Cratchits set chairs for everybody.
At last, all was set and grace was said, which was followed by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit began to carve. When the long-expected gush of steam and juices issued forth, one common murmur of delight arose all around the board. Even Tiny Tim beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!"
Never was there such a goose, none, nor cooked so well. Its tenderness, flavor, size, and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for all 8 of them. Indeed, surveying one small fleck upon the bone, Mrs. Cratchit laughed and said they hadn't eaten it all. The youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. Then the plates were cleared, and Mrs. Cratchit rose to take the pudding up. Soon there was a great rush of steam from the kitchen. A Christmas pudding is, as you know, bits of dried fruit, meat, breadcrumbs, spices, and flour all wrapped together in a cloth and set to boil in a big pot. When Mrs. Cratchit opened the big copper kettle, the released steam smelled first like wash day. That was a cloth. Then, as the pudding was turned out, the smells of a pastry shop and an eating house mixed in with the steam, forming a sweet aroma that billowed out to an army of expectant noses. Smiling proudly, Mrs. Cratchit entered with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball ablaze in a half-quarter cup of ignited brandy bedight with a Christmas holly.
Oh, what a wonderful pudding. Mr. and Mrs. Cratchit entered with it, and Bob Cratchit proclaimed it to be the greatest success since their marriage. Everyone had something to say about it, but nobody said, or even thought, that it was at all a small pudding for so large a family. They would have blushed to think it. At last, the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared and the fire made up. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, a shovelful of chestnuts upon the fire, and the whole Cratchit family drew round the hearth. At Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family's complete collection of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. Into these golden goblets, Bob poured out a hot punch with a beaming smile, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. And then Bob proposed a toast.
A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears, which sentiment was echoed by all the family, including with a thin,
God bless us, everyone, from Tiny Tim.
Yes, he sat upon his little stool, very close to his father's side, and Bob held his withered little hand as if he dreaded that he might be taken from him. It was a scene so tender that to it no one could be immune.
Spirit, tell me, will Tiny Tim live?
I see a vacant chair and a crutch without an owner. If the shadows remain unaltered by the future.
No, kind spirit, no. Say he will be spared.
Why? What of it? If he be left to die, he had best do it now and decrease the surplus population.
Scrooge bent his head over this rebuke, before this rebuke. But then he raised it suddenly, for he had heard his own name called out.
To Mr. Scrooge, said Bob, to the founder of our feast.
Mr. Scrooge, said Mrs. Cratchit. To Mr. Scrooge, indeed. Why, I wish I had him right here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon.
Dear, it's Christmas Day. Join my toast.
It could only be Christmas Day, I am sure, when one would drink the health of such an odious, stingy, unfeeling piece of flint as this Mr. Scrooge. You know it's true, Robert. No one knows it better than you.
No, my dear, it is Christmas Day. Join my toast.
All right. I'll drink to his health, but for your sake and the sake of the day, not for his. Long life to him. There. I have no doubt that he'll be making very merry today. Well, it took a few minutes for the shadow caused by the mere mention of Scrooge's name to pass from the scene, but then they were 10 times happier than before, if only to be done with Mr. Scrooge, the ogre of the family. They chatted of work, of pleasant memories, and of distant hopes. As they spoke, the chestnuts and the punch went round and round. Tiny Tim gave them a song about a child lost traveling in the snow. And with his plaintive little voice, he sang it very well indeed.
Well, there was nothing of high mark in any of this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their clothes were even scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, contented with the time. And when they faded from view, Scrooge had his eye thoughtfully upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim. And
then the scene dimmed and vanished. And Scrooge was surprised to hear a very hearty laugh. And then he was further surprised to recognize it as that of his own nephew. And he was surprised all the more to find himself standing in a bright, gleaming room with the giant smiling at his side.
And it is fair, even and noble adjustment of things, that while disease and sorrow can be infectious, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter. When Scrooge's nephew laughed, his wife laughed as heartily as he, and their friends all laughed as well. He said, Christmas was a humbug, as I live.
More shame to him, Fred, said his wife.
Oh, he's a comical old fellow, that's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. But But I have nothing to say against him, for who suffers from his ill whims? Himself, always himself. Here, he takes it in his head to dislike us, won't come and dine with us, and what is the result? That he loses a very good dinner.
To this, everyone concurred, having just consumed the dinner in question, and it was very good indeed.
I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not. But this time, Fred, his wife, and their friends and relatives had clustered around the fireplace, and after singing some songs, they played at games. For it is good to be a child sometimes, and never better than in Christmas Day, whose mighty founder was, after all, a child himself. They played blind man's bluff, and on a bit voyage I did go, and who, what, and where.
Scrooge became so engaged in these guessing games that he quite forgot why he was there in the first place, and that his voice made no impression upon their ears. He sometimes called out his own guesses, and very often he guessed right. His attitude had changed to such a remarkable degree that he would have drunk the health of the whole crowd there, but he begged to the spirit, like a child, not to be taken from the scene just yet. Just 1/2 hour more, spirit, only that. For they had just started a game of yes or no. His nephew had thought of something, and the rest were trying to figure out what it was by asking him questions, which he would answer with a simple yes or no. The fire of questioning to which Fred was exposed showed that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, or rather disagreeable live animal, a disagreeable animal that grunted and sometimes growled. Yes, it lived in London, but no, it didn't live in a zoo. Yes, it walked around the streets, but no, it was not a horse, or a dog, or a cow, or a tiger, or a bear. Fred was so tickled with his friend's puzzlement that at each new question he burst into a fresh roar of laughter. At last, one of his wife's sisters cried out,
I know what it is, Fred! It's your Uncle Scrooge!
which it certainly was, and all laughed over it. Some, however, objected that the answer to, is it a bear, should have been a yes. Ebenezer Scrooge, watching and listening to all of this, had become so light of heart. As I said, he would have loved to have drank the health of the whole company if they had only been sensible of him. Then the scene misted, and passed off, and he and the spirit were once again on their travels.
They traveled far and saw much, visiting many homes and also workplaces. They visited places that were busy and places that were lonely. But always they saw people keeping Christmas, even if only to share the blessings of the day. The Spirit stood by sick beds, stood amongst poverty. He stood near struggling, desperate men, and all were made lighter in their hearts by the blessings of his torch. In the workhouse, hospital, or jail, in misery's every refuge, the Spirit left his blessings and taught Scrooge its precepts.
Then, just before the bell tolled, the giant brought from within the many folds of his robe 2 ragged children, who knelt and clutched at the skirts of his garment. Meager, yellow, wolfish, miserable, wretched, and alone, these 2 appeared immune to the blessings from the giant's torch.
Their bodies, wherein youth and grace belong, had been pinched and twisted into things abject. On their faces, where hopeful angels might have sat enthroned, now devils lurked and glowered. The perverse chance mutations of creation had never formed monsters half so horrible as these.
Spirit, said Scrooge, pointing to them. Those children! Whose are they? Are they yours?
They are man's. The girl is locked, the boy is ignorance. Beware of them, heed them, or abide the doom that they will bring forth.
What, is there no shelter for them? No refuge?
Are there no prisons? Are the workhouses all full?
And the bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about, but the ghost and the wretched children were gone. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Marley that there would be 3 spirits. And lifting up his eyes, he beheld a solemn phantom draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him.
The phantom approached slowly, silently. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, face, and form, leaving nothing visible save one outstretched hand.
Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come? I think I fear you most of all, but I want to learn from your precepts. Will you speak to me?
But it gave no reply. His hand only pointed straight before them, and as Scrooge looked, the business district of the city seemed to spring up about them, and there they were in the very heart of it, at the corner near the exchange. The spirit stopped beside a little knot of businessmen and pointed to them. Scrooge knew these men, for he had made a point of always standing well in their esteem, strictly from a business point of view, you understand. He now advanced towards them to listen, and he assumed to learn from their talk.
No, I don't know much about it, said a great fat man. I only know that he's dead.
When did he die? Inquired a red flag.
Last night.
Oh, I thought he'd never die. So, what has he done with his money?
I haven't heard, but I know this. He didn't leave it to me.
With this pleasantry, the subject was closed and conversation moved on to other topics. Scrooge was surprised that the spirit would direct him so apparently a trivial conversation, but feeling that there must be some purpose in it, he tried to make out what it could be. While pondering this, he looked about for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner. This did not bother him because he had been turning around in his mind that he would alter his way of life, and he hoped that the changes in scene before him confirmed the carrying out of his newborn resolutions.
Scrooge and the spirit then left the busy street, and they traveled into an obscure part of town. They went far into an infamous quarter and came to a low, mean, beetling old shop where scrap iron, bones, bottles, and rags were bought. Inside, they found a gaunt, gray-haired rascal of great age who sat there smoking his pipe among the piles of iron, bones, rusty hardware, and mountains of dirty rags. Scrooge and the phantom came into the presence of this man as a woman slunk in with a heavy bundle. She looked to be one of the lower sorts of housemaids or cleaning women.
Joe, what have you got for me? What have we got here, Sal?
And the woman slung the bundle to the ground, where Joe, as was his name, got down to examine it.
Oh, looks like you've been picking very well. I see.
Well, it's my opinion that if anyone owned these things wanted them to stay in place after he was laid out, he should have acted more natural when he was alive. That way he would have had someone to be with him when he was struck down, instead of lying there alone to gasp out his last, wicked old miser. So, what's the value of it, eh, Joe?
Yeah, let's see, what have you got here? Bed curtains, huh? Oh, you mean to tell me you took down his bed curtains and the rings and all with him lying there?
I certainly did, and why not? I shan't hold my hands back for one such as him. He never held his hands back, that's sure. Besides, who's the worst for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, sure. Hey, now, how about them blankets, eh?
Oh, Core, you took his blankets off him? You are a cool one.
I certainly did. Where he's going, blankets is one thing he won't be needing. And here, his shirt, his best one, not a hole or threadbare place in it. Why, they'd have wasted it sure, dressing the likes of him in it to be buried in.
You took his shirt off him.
I did. This is the end of it, don't you see? He frightened everyone away when he was alive, so as to profit us when he was dead.
Right, you are. You got that for business, and that's the truth.
Scrooge listened in a sort of horror sat huddled around the dead man's things. Spirit, I see, I understand. The case of the unhappy man they've robbed might well be my own. My own life did tend in that way before.
Then abruptly, once more the scene changed, and Scrooge stood before a bare, uncurtained bed, paled in the waning afternoon light. On it, unwept, unwashed, uncared for, was the body of the plundered unknown man. It lay in a dark, empty house in a lonely room, a face in shadow, and with not a man, woman, or child to say that they remembered him, or how he had been kind to them in this or that way. There was no prayers or sobs or muffled, respectful talking, just the noise of a cat in the hall and the gnawing of the rats beneath the hearthstone.
Spirit, is there no person who feels some emotion for this man's death? Please show me that person and that emotion, I beg you.
The spirit hesitated, and then spread his dark robe before him like a wing. Withdrawing it, Scrooge beheld a poor room by daylight with a mother and children within. The mother showed every sign of anxious eagerness as she hurried to open the door to her husband, whose own young face was etched with the strain of worry.
The news, she asked, the news. Is it good or bad? Is he determined to see us ruined, or will he relent?
And a smile slowly broke over the husband's face. Look, he is past all relenting, I dare say. Apparently the housekeeper was telling the truth yesterday when she said that he was too ill to see me. I thought he refused to hear my request for a week's grace out of plain meanness. But seeing he was at that moment dying.
To which the woman bowed her head and softly whispered, Thank God.
I don't know to whom our debt will be transferred, but it would be hard indeed to find another creditor so merciless as he.
And the faces of the children in the room, who stood clustered nearby, brightened. They could not understand what they heard, but they could sense that theirs was now a happier home for this man's death. But that was the only emotion that the Spirit could show to Scrooge. Nay, Spirit, nay! Is there no tender concern connected with the death? Let me see some feelings of tenderness, please.
Once more the scene misted over, changed, and again they were in the dwelling of the Cratchit family. Mother and daughters were seated around the fire doing piecework. The little Cratchits were sitting in one corner as still as statues, while Peter read to them, all from a book. And he took a little child and set him in the midst of them. But Peter stopped abruptly as his mother laid her work on the table and put her hand to her face.
It's nothing, sobbed Mrs. Cratchit. It's the needlework. It's these colors. They hurt my eyes.
But it wasn't the colors, poor woman. It was Tiny Tim.
Now, we mustn't show weak or teary eyes to your father, not for the world. Why, it's time for him to be home, isn't it?
Past time, said Peter. I think he's walking slower than he used to. He used to walk so very fast with Tim on his shoulder. He was so light there was no trouble at all. As he spoke, Bob Cratchit came to the door in his long white scarf, which he sorely needed in the cold. His tea was ready for him, and they all tried to help him to it to see who could help the most. The two little Cratchits pressed their cheeks to his as if to say, Don't be sad, Father. But Bob spoke pleasantly to all the family, and surveying the work upon the table, praised the industry of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls.
Did you go today, Robert?
Yes, my dear. And it will do you good to see how sweet a place it is. And you'll see it often, I think, for I promised them that we would walk there on Sundays. My little child. My little child. He broke down in tears. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been further apart than perhaps they were. Bob went upstairs to the little room that was lighted and hung cheerfully with Christmas. Poor Bob. He sat down in a chair next to his cold little form, and when he had composed himself, kissed the cold, still little face.
Witnessing this scene, Scrooge felt a sudden, sharp pang of apprehension. Spirit, this is important. I need to know. What was that man we saw lying on that curtainless bed?
But the ghost did not speak. Instead, the scene misted and rearranged itself, this time to a bleak, dismal churchyard. Standing among this grave, the spirit pointed a spectral finger down to one.
Before I draw near to this stone, tell me one thing. Are these the scenes of things that will be, or the scenes of things that may be only? Please tell it to me now, what you're about to show me.
But the ghost did not answer. It only pointed down at the grave.
The course of a man's life determines certain ends. It's true, it foreshadows those ends. But if the course be changed, the end will also change, won't it? Please say it is thus, with what you're about to show me.
But the spirit remained mute and immovable, pointing still. Scrooge crept towards the spot, trembling as he went, and read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge.
Am I the man who lay upon that bed? Oh, no, Spirit, no. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I might have been. I will honor Christmas. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. Oh, assure me, Spirit, that with an altered life I may yet change these shadows you have shown me. And holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost.
Yes, the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. And happiest of all, the time before him was his own. It was not too late. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, no night, only clear, bright, stirring, golden day. He shouted down to a boy in his Sunday clothes upon the street.
What's today?
Today? Well, love me, son, it's Christmas Day.
It's Christmas. Hello, I haven't missed it. And thinking quickly, he said, Young man, do you know the poulterer's shop 2 streets over?
Oh, yes, I should hope I do, sir.
Yes, you are remarkable, most intelligent. Well, do you know, did they sell the prize turkey hanging in the window?
What, the one as big as me? Oh, it's hanging there now.
Oh, delightful, young fellow. Go and tell them that I shall buy it. Have a man come that I may tell him where to take it. Come back with the man and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in 5 minutes and I'll give you a half-crown.
And the boy was off through the snowy streets like a shot.
I'll send it to Bob Cratchit. He shan't know who sent it. Why, it's twice the size of Tiny Tim. And Scrooge laughed to think that such a joke as this played on Bob Cratchit. There never was. Then he dressed himself in his best, and he went out into the streets where people were pouring forth to share the day with friends and loved ones. As he walked through the bustling streets, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. And 3 or 4 good-humored men, not recognizing him, said,
Good morning, sir, and a Merry Christmas to you.
And Scrooge said afterwards that of all the sweet sounds he had ever heard, those words were the sweetest.
He headed towards his nephew's house, and when he reached it, passed back and forth in the street several times before he had the courage to go up to the door and knock upon it. Oh, why, bless my soul, said Fred. Who's this?
It's I, your uncle. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in?
Let him in? It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was in the house in 5 minutes. Nothing could have been heartier. Everything looked just the same as it had been with the ghost. A wonderful party, wonderful dinner, wonderful games, and a wonderful oneness of heart.
Well, Scrooge was early into the office the next morning. Oh, wouldn't it be fun if only he could be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming in late? That would be capital. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob.
Bob Cratchit was a full 18 minutes and 1/2 behind the time when he would come in. A scarf, too. He was on his stool in a jiffy and driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
"Hello," growled Scrooge, trying to replicate his old accustomed voice. "What do you mean by coming in here at this time of day?"
"Very sorry, sir. I am behind my time."
"Yes, you are. Step this way, if you please."
"It's only once a year, sir. It cannot be repeated. The truth is, I was making rather merry yesterday, sir."
"Now let me tell you, my young friend, I am not going to stand for this sort of behavior anymore. And therefore," he said, giving Bob a poke in the ribs, "I am going to have to raise your salary."
Bob trembled, grimaced, and stared back a bit. For a moment, he had the idea of knocking Scrooge down and calling out for a straightwaist jacket.
"A Merry Christmas, Bob. A merrier Christmas than I have given you in many a year." And he clapped him upon the back, and there was an earnestness in his voice that could not be mistaken. "I will raise your salary, Bob Cratchit, that I will, and I will do my best to help your family. To that end, we'll discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop. That's hot punch. Make up the fires, Bob Cratchit, and before you dot another I, go out on the company's account and buy us some more coal."
Scrooge was as good as his word, and then some. To Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was like a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as a good old city knew. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he did not matter to Scrooge, for his own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him.
Although it might sound strange, Scrooge had no further meeting with spirits, for he had no need. Moreover, it was always said of him after that of any man alive, it was Scrooge who knew how to keep Christmas well. May that truly be said of all of us. And as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you here tonight. Thank you for coming out. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.